Hello, I'm back with Stephen King's The Shining. I'm on chapter 14, Up on the Roof. Oh, you goddamn son of a bitch. Jack Torrance cries these words out in both surprise and agony as he slapped his right hand against his blue chambray work shirt, dislodging the big, slow-moving wasp that had stung him. Then he was scrambling up the roof as fast as he could, looking over his shoulder to see what the wasp's brothers and sisters were rising from the nest he had uncovered to do battle. If they were, it could be bad. The nest was between him and his ladder, and the trap door leading down onto the attic was locked from the inside. The drop was 70 feet from the roof to the cement patio between the hotel and the lawn. The clear air above the nest was still and undisturbed. Jack whistled disgustedly between his teeth, sat straddling the peak of the roof, and examined his right index finger. It was swelling already, and he supposed he would have to try and creep past the nest to his ladder so he could go down and put some ice on it. It was October 20th. Wendy and Danny had gone down to Sidewinder in the hotel truck, an elderly rattling Dodge that was still more trustworthy than the Volkswagen, which was now wheezing gravely and seemed terminal to get 3 gallons of milk and do some Christmas shopping. It was early to shop, but there was no telling when the snow would come to stay. There had already been flurries, and in some place the road down from the overlook was slick with patch ice. So far the fall had been almost preternaturally beautiful. In the 3 weeks they had been there, golden day had followed golden day. Crisp 30-degree mornings gave way to afternoon temperatures in the low 60s. The perfect temperature for climbing around on the overlook's gently sloping western roof and doing the shingling. Jack had admitted freely to Wendy that he could have finished the job in 4 days ago, but he felt no real urge to hurry. The view from up here was spectacular, even putting the vista from the presidential suite in the shade. More important, the work itself was soothing. On the roof he felt himself healing from the troubled wounds of the last 3 years. On the roof he felt at peace. Those 3 years began to seem like a turbulent nightmare. The shingles had been badly rotted, some of them blown entirely away by the last winter's storms. He had ripped them all up, yelling "bombs away" as he dropped them over the side, not wanting Danny to get hit in case he had wandered over. He had been pulling out bad flashing when the wasp had gotten him. The ironic part was that he wore himself each time he climbed up onto the roof to keep an eye out for the nests. He had gotten the bug bomb just in case, but this morning the stillness and peace had been so complete that his watchfulness had lapsed. He had been back in the world of the play. He was slowly creating, roughing out whatever scene he would be working on the evening in his head. The play was going very well, and although Wendy had said little, he knew she was pleased. He had been roadblocked in the crucial scene between Denker, the sadistic headmaster, and Gary Benson, his young hero, during the last unhappy 6 months at Stovington. At Stovington, months when the craving for the drink had been so bad that he could barely concentrate on his in-class lectures, let alone his extracurricular literary ambitions. But in the last 12 evenings, as he actually sat down in front of the office model Underwood he had borrowed from the main office downstairs, the roadblock had disappeared under his fingers as magically as cotton candy dissolved on the lips. He had come up almost effortlessly with the insights into Dexter's character that had always been lacking, and he had rewritten most of the second act accordingly, making it revolve around the new scene. And the progress of the third act, which he had been turning over in his mind, was coming clearer all the time. He thought he could rough it up in 2 weeks and have a clean copy of the whole damn play by New Year's. He had an agent in New York, a rough, red-headed woman named Phyllis Sandler, who smoked Herbert Terratones, drank Jim Beam from a paper cup, that the literary sun rose and set on Sean O'Casey. She had marketed 3 of Jack's short stories, including the Esquire piece. He had written her about the play, which was called The Little School, describing the basic conflict between Denker, a gifted student who had failed into becoming the brutal and brutalizing headmaster of the turn-of-the-century New England prep school, and Gary Benson, the student he sees as a younger version of himself. Phyllis had written back expressing interest and admonishing him to read O'Casey before sitting down to it. She had written again earlier that year asking where the hell was the play. He had written back wryly that The Little School had been indefinitely and perhaps infinitely delayed between hand and page, and that interesting intellectual goby known as the writer's block. Now it looked as if she might actually get to play. Whether or not it was any good or if it would ever see actual production was another matter, and he didn't seem to care a great deal about those things. He felt it in a way that the play itself, the whole thing, was the roadblock, a colossal symbol of the bad years at Stovington Prep. The marriage he had almost totaled like a nutty kid behind the wheel of an old jalopy, the monstrous assault on his son, the incident in the parking lot with George Hatfield, an incident he would no longer view as just another sudden and destructive flare of temper. He now thought that the part of his drinking problem had stemmed from an unconscious desire to be free of Stovington, and the security he felt was stifling whatever creative urge he had. He had stopped drinking, but the need to be free had been just as great. Hence George Hatfield. Now all the remaining of those days was to play on the desk in his and Wendy's bedroom, and when it was done and sent off to Phyllis's hole-in-the-wall New York agency, he could turn to other things, not a novel. He was not ready to stumble into the swamp of another 3-year undertaking, but surely more short stories, perhaps a book of them. Moving warily, he scrambled back down the slope of the roof on his hands and knees, past the line of demarcation where the fresh green bird shingles gave way to the section of the roof he had just finished clearing. He came to the edge on the left of the wasp's nest he had uncovered and moved gingerly toward it, ready to backtrack and bolt down his ladder to the ground if things looked too hot. He leaned over the section of pulled-out flashing and looked in. The nest was in there, tucked into the space between the old flashing and the final roof undercoating of 3x5s. It was a damn big one. The grayish paper ball looked to Jack as if it might be nearly 2 feet through the center. Its shape was not perfect because the space between the flashing and the boards was too narrow, but he thought the little buggers had still done a pretty respectable job. The surface of the nest was a crawl with the lumbering, slow-moving insects. They were the big, mean ones, not yellow jackets, which are smaller and calmer, but wall wasps. They had been rendered sludgy and stupid by the fall temperatures, but Jack, who knew about wasps from his childhood, counted himself that he had been stung only once, and he thought if Ullman had hired the job in the height of the summer, the workman who tore up the particular section of the flashing would have gotten one hell of a surprise. Yes, indeedy. When a dozen wall wasps land on you all at once and start stinging your face and hands and arms, stinging your legs right through your pants, it would be entirely possible to forget you were 70 feet up. You might just charge right off the edge of the roof while you were trying to get away from them. All from those little things, the biggest of them only half the length of a pencil stub. He had read someplace in a Sunday supplement piece or back of the book news magazine article that 7% of all automobile fatalities go unexplained. No mechanical failure, no excessive speed, no booze, no bad weather. Simply one car crashes on deserted sections of the road. One dead occupant, the driver unable to explain what had happened to him. The article had included an interview with a state trooper who theorized that many of these so-called foo crashes resulted from insects in the car, wasps, a bee, possibly even a spider or a moth. The driver gets panicky, tries to swat it or unroll the window to let it out. Possibly the insect stings him. Maybe the driver just loses control. Either way, it's bang all over. And the insect usually completely unharmed, would buzz merrily out of the smoking wreck, looking for greener pastures. The trooper had been in favor of having pathologists look for insect venom while autopsying each victim's, Jack recalled. Now, looking down into the nest, it seemed to him that it would serve as both a workable symbol for what he had been through and what he had dragged his hostages to fortune through, and an omen for a better future. How else could you explain the things that had happened to him? For he still felt that the whole range of unhappy Stovington experiences had to be looked at with Jack Torrance in the passive mode. He had not done things. Things had done to him. He had known plenty of people on the Stovington faculty, 2 of them right in the English department, who were hard drinkers. Zach Tunney was in the habit of picking up a full keg of beer on Saturday afternoon, plonking it in the backyard snowbank overnight, and then killing damn near all of it on Sunday watching football games and old movies. Yet through the week, Zach was as sober as a judge. A weak cocktail with lunch was an occasion. He and Al Shockley had been alcoholics. They had sought each other out like 2 cast-offs who were still social enough to prefer drowning together to doing it alone. The sea had been whole grain instead of salt. That was all. Looking down at the wasps as they slowly went about their instinctual business before winter closed down to kill all but their hibernating queen. He would go further. He was still an alcoholic, always would be. Perhaps had been since sophomore class night in high school, when he had taken his first drink. It had nothing to do with willpower or the mortality of drinking, the morality of drinking, or the weakness or strength of his own character. There was a broken switch somewhere inside, or a circuit breaker that didn't work. And he had propelled down the chute willy-nilly, slowly at first, then accelerating as Stovington applied its pressures on him. A big grease slide, and at the bottom had been a shattered, ownerless bicycle and a son with a broken arm. Jack Torrance in the passive mode and its temper, same thing. All his life he had been trying unsuccessfully to control it. He could remember himself at 7 spanked by a neighbor lady for playing with matches. He had gone out and hurled a rock at a passing car. His father had seen that, and he had descended on little Jackie, roaring. He had reddened Jack's behind, and then blackened his eye, and when his father had gone into the house, muttering, to see what was on television, Jack had come upon a stray dog and kicked him into the gutter. There had been 24 fights in grammar school, even more of them in high school, warranting 2 suspensions and uncounted detentions in spite of his good grades. Football had provided a partial safety value, although he remembered perfectly well that he had spent almost every minute of every game in a state of high piss-off, taking every opposing block and tackle personally. He had been a fine player, making all-conference in his junior and senior years, and he knew perfectly well that he had his own bad temper to thank or blame. He had not enjoyed football. Every game was a grudge match, and yet through it all he had felt like a son of a bitch. He hadn't felt mean. He had always regarded himself as Jack Torrance, a really nice guy who was just going to have to learn how to cope with his temper someday before it got him into trouble. The same way he was going to learn how to cope with his drinking. But he had been an emotional alcoholic just as surely as he had been a physical one. The 2 of them were no doubt tied together somewhere deep inside him, where you'd just as soon not look. But it didn't much matter to him if the root causes were interrelated or separate, sociological or psychological or sociological or psychological. He had to deal with his results, the spankings, the beatings from his old man, the suspensions with trying to explain school clothes torn and playground brawls, and later the hangovers, the slowly dissolving glue of his marriage, the single bicycle wheel with its bent spokes pointing into the sky, Danny's broken arm, and George Hatfield, of course. He felt that he had unwillingly stuck his hand into the great wasp's nest of life, As an image, it stank. As a cameo of reality, he felt it was serviceable. He had stuck his hand through some rotted flashing in high summer, and that hand and his whole arm had been consumed in holy, righteous fire, destroying conscious thought, making the concept of civilized behavior obsolete. Could you be expected to behave as a thinking human being when your hand was being impaled on red-hot darning needles? Could you be expecting to live in the love of your nearest and dearest when the brown, furious cloud rose out of the hole in the fabric of things? The fabric you thought was so innocent and arrowed straight at you. Could you be held responsible for your own actions as you ran crazily about on the sloping roof 70 feet above the ground, not knowing where you were going, not remembering that your panicky, stumbling feet could lead you crashing and blundering right over the rain gutter and down to your death on the concrete 70 feet below? Damn. Jack didn't think you could when you unwittingly stuck your hand into the wasp nest. You hadn't made a covenant with the devil to give up your civilized self with its trappings of love and respect and honor. It just happened to you, passively with no say. You ceased to be a creature of the mind and became a creature of the nerve endings. From college-educated man to wailing ape in 5 easy seconds. He thought about George Hatfield. Tall and shaggily blonde, George had been an almost insolently beautiful boy in his tight-fitted jeans and Stovington sweatshirt with the sleeves carelessly pushed up to the elbows to disclose his tanned forearms. He had reminded Jack of a young Robert Redford, and he had doubted that George had much trouble scoring. No more than that young football-playing devil Jack Torrance had it 10 years earlier. He could say that he honestly didn't feel jealous of George or envy him his good looks. In fact, he had almost unconsciously began to visualize George as a physical incarnation of his play hero, Gary Benson, the perfect foil for the dark, slumped, and aging Denker who grew to hate Gary so much, but he, Jack Torrance, had never felt that way about George. If he had, he would have known it. He was quite sure of that. George had floated through his classes at Stovington, a soccer and baseball star. His academic program had been fairly undemanding, and he had content with C's and occasional B in history or botany. He was a fierce field contender and a lackadaisical, amused sort of student in a classroom. Jack was familiar with the type more from his own days as a high school and college student than from his teaching experience, which was at second hand. George Hatfield was a jock. He could be a calm, undemanding figure in the classroom, but when the right set of competitive stimuli was applied like electrodes to the temples of Frankenstein's monster, Jack thought wryly, he could become a juggernaut.